With the Fed now likely to stay on hold this week, how will the Bangko Sentral decide in its next meeting on April 10? With us now for more live in Hong Kong is Aris Dacanay, an economist for the ASEAN at HSBC. Good to have you with us, Aris. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, thank you for having us.
All right, so put yourself in Governor Ellie's shoes for a moment. How much would it matter if the Fed held back from cutting this week?
So if you actually hold back from cutting this week, there are a lot of trade-offs. What are the economic trends that we're seeing today? One, consumption is down. Private consumption, the bulwark of the Philippine economy is down, growing by around 4.5%. Yes, that may be good in international standards, but if you look at it in the Philippine history, it is the slowest pace of household consumption growth ever since the global financial crisis. So that doesn't really fare well. And the reasons being is high interest rates. You look at the numbers, a lot of these consumers, Filipino consumers, are reeling back on what you call their big ticket purchases. Anything that involves taking out credit, such as, let's say, buying a gadget, buying your next home, buying your next automobiles, all of these are down. And with high interest rates, you could really see it feeding through these slow numbers. So keeping rates on hold has a cost. And the cost may be aggravated by the fact if other ASEAN central banks are actually cutting interest rates. Now, okay, this is quite complicated, so let's take it step by step. If the BSP decides to hold interest rates while others in ASEAN decides to cut, the peso will strengthen. As mentioned a while ago earlier in the news, some people are projecting the peso to reach 56. But if other currencies actually depreciate against the US dollars, what will happen is that foreigners will look at the Philippine peso as expensive as compared to others that are cheap. So demand would actually go to Thailand, to Indonesia, maybe Malaysia, Vietnam.
But Aris,
And rather than, let's say, for a tourist, let's say a tourist from America or a tourist from UK,
people who watch the currency
why would I go
markets?
to the Philippines if it's cheaper for me to instead take my vacation in Thailand?
Okay, now I want to do that, but I want to look at the interest rate differential first. How much of a deciding factor do you think is that differential between the Bangko Central's overnight reverse repurchase rate and the Fed's key rate? Because the previous central bank governor, Felipe Medalla, had made a big deal out of the interest rate differential. But what do you think in the current governorship of Eli Remolona?
I think right now fears are there, and I think the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas was very clear that it wanted to hedge the risk in terms of FX volatility. While there's uncertainty in trade, at least particularly on what tariffs will actually come up, the BSP decided to stay on hold and see how the markets would play out. Right now, we're seeing the tariff risk clearer and clearer and clearer. And you could see here that we are managing. The peso is currently at, again, 57.2. There is space to actually narrow this interest rate differential further, balance your risk in a way that this differential would matter less. And what would matter more is actually supporting growth. And to be able to support growth,
what you're
and to be
saying
able
then,
to support
Aris,
your
is that
exporters.
there's a lot more room for the Bangko Sentral to decide on cutting interest rates.
Yes.
So the question is now, how deep is that cut going to be on April 10th?
So I think it's gonna be a 25 basis point rate cut. All throughout, I do think there's room for 75 basis points. This is under the assumption that the Fed would actually cut by 75 basis points or less. But then again, regardless of whatever the Fed does, I do think there's 75 basis points in the line for the BSP.
Okay, but we got one more data point there to consider, and that's a reason why the central bank moved its meeting from April 3rd to April 10th. It's got that inflation data coming out on April 5th. How much of a deciding factor might this be if indeed we're let loose from the Fed and whatever it does in the next 48 hours?
It's a big factor. The reason why everyone's pricing in a rate cut in the next, it's either in April or in June, is the fact that inflation really surprised to the downside at 2.1% last month. And that momentum, or at least sequentially, should bring down the March inflation figure to, again, at a level that would warrant a rate cut. So it's a big deal. It opened the doors and it created more room for the BSP to decouple itself from the Fed.
All right, we got a minute to go. We talked about holidays there. How much stronger will the peso be in the next 3 to 6 months so I could plan out where I go?
We do think the peso can, maybe in the next 3 months or so, it can depreciate to as much as 58, 58.5, or at least to that direction. Mainly because if you cut ahead of the Fed, there is some adjustment, there is some volatility that can enter the market. But yeah, I do think if you keep the peso strong, or at least stronger than your other ASEAN peers, it may be a headwind to your services exports.
Got that. So I got to book that trip now before the peso falls. Thank you so much, Aris. Really appreciate the time. And see you soon in Manila. Aris Dacanay of HSBC live in Hong Kong.